That one. That's my favorite. Today I'm going to show you how to make Boba Fett's jetpack. Let's get into it. For this build, I used EVA foam, craft foam, coffee foam, putty, super glue, green paint, mouthwash caps, model rocket parts, cutting tools, sanding tools, safety gear, scissors, razor pens, and a box cutter. I cut the puzzle pieces off of a floor tile. I'm using EVA foam because aside from being my, material of choice, it's lightweight, which is important when you're wearing a costume all day, and also it's damage resistant. So if you drop it, it will absorb the impact rather than break. I traced a square onto the foam with a paint pen. I also marked where I would cut the corners later. Then I used a sharpened work knife to cut out the square. Notice I'm using machinist blocks to keep my carpentry square in place. It takes a lot of pressure to cut through the foam and I don't want it to move around on me, so that's what that's about. I don't know what it is, but the 1/2 inch thick EVA foam always seems to cut better. Now this is going to look a little bit too tall to some people, and they're absolutely right. It's because we have to cut off the corners up here, and even then it might be a little too tall. I may have to cut that down another inch. Sorry, freedom unit. So I cut a couple of inches off of the top to make it into more of a rectangle. Then I cut the corners off. Some of the edges are still rough from where I cut the puzzle pieces. And also the bottom is just a little bit slanted. So I sanded it smooth on my belt sander. So this is always the most time-consuming footage that I have to edit. And there's really not that much for me to say under this footage other than sand it. It's pretty straightforward. Oh, I built a dust chute to direct the dust straight into the trash and away from my bench vise just so the dust doesn't gum up the screw mechanism. I like it. That's it. That's all I got. Moving on. Alright, so we can have this texture on the back and then it will almost never be seen, but that's limiting if the client wants to do like a suit up montage, then they're always going to have it with this side aimed away from the camera. So instead, this is going to be the side that we build up all of the thrusters and fuel tanks and all that stuff, which means we'll only need to cover up this top bit. So I went ahead and covered that up with a roll of 2mm craft foam. Can't believe this was the smallest piece I had to work with. Now, as I'm working on this, it's gonna look a little small, and that's not a scale issue. It's because it isn't for me, it's for a client who's, I think, like a full foot shorter than me. That's not a dig, that's just a fact. When the glue dried, I cut off the excess and then trimmed it to be flush with the backing. Then I cut the trench down the center. This is just to make the center tube more secure and have a slightly lower profile from a side view. I can't seem to ever get rid of the spiral in cardboard, so I'm just gonna cover it up with school glue and cardstock. Cardstock is just real thick paper, by the way. I understand how annoying it is when I repeat myself to the regular viewers, but I gotta do it. In this case, it's also gonna lengthen the tube because I cut this up for another project. I'm not sure which one. So while that's drying, I'm gonna make the side tubes out of these rocket bodies. And I'm using them because they have to be half the diameter. Diameter? Yeah, so that would be radius, right? Of the central tube. Now these ends are damaged, so I'm gonna have to cut them off. Luckily, yeah, they only have to be a few inches. So to get the vent at the bottom and also the internal structural pieces, I'm gonna use this end cap that was originally from when it was a poster tube. Then I traced the circles for the internal nose cone supports. I traced and cut concentric rings for the rockets to fit onto. And this edge is not going to be exposed at all, so I'm just going to use scissors and then clean it up a bit on the belt sander. And that'll be much more effective in terms of time. Really want this to be a one-day build. It won't, because painting is always a thing, but it could be built in a day. Actually, the client hasn't decided on a paint job, and I kind of shot myself in the foot by starting the paint job in the last one. That's also an issue with doing a build over a long period of time. So this, if I were to cut this circle out, it would essentially just create an O-ring, and that would not be stable enough to hold this thing in place. So rather than cutting that out, I'm gonna make another circle to match the interior diameter, glue that on top, and then I can just stick it on there. And that'll be way more stable. This is part of a rocket from a model rocket kit. I'm gonna use this for the lady version, and this base, this adapter, Boba Fett missile version, and they'll be interchangeable. I glued the rings together to form a little Devo hat. So now the nose cones are interchangeable, although you may want to add an extra layer for more stability. For the taller one, Boba's rocket is kind of tall, so it'd be easy for that to get knocked off if you didn't have more internal supports. I don't know if this is true, but I get the impression that the tall rocket causes a lot of problems while filming, because it's right at head level. It'd be easy to bump into and break if the Mandalorian or whoever is wearing that armor looks up really fast, because Boba's is the only jetpack that I've seen so far with that top rocket. Like, none of the major Mandalorian characters have it. Even the sheriff, he's replaced it with a slightly stubbier version. Just something to think about if you're designing an original character. So now I gotta do the edges. Then I made the little slanted bevels along the outer circumference. I did this by taking this piece of scrap foam that I cut slanted from a previous build and cut it into tiny little pieces, like as if I were cutting a carrot, a very poison carrot. Then I cut those individual pieces in half. They're mostly uniform. Mostly. Wrong franchise, Newt. Then I put the nose cone back on and attached 4 of them just so that I'd be able to get the spacing right. Oh, hey, real quick. I think I should just make a quick safety announcement because I know somebody's gonna try this. Don't try and incorporate the model rocket motors into your project. They're basically bullets with blowtorches coming out the back of them, like slow tracer rounds. And there's no controlling them if they're in something non-aerodynamic. I had a rocket get stuck on the launch gantry once and expend all of its fuel while still on the launch pad. And even though it was like stuck a foot above the blast plate, it burned a hole straight through, like straight through steel. So just imagine if that's stuck on your body. It's definitely gonna burn a hole through a human. So don't mess around with rockets. Man, how is that even still a thing? It's gonna be the next band hobby. This concludes prop safety with William Jakespeare. When all the details were attached to the rim, I moved on to the vent at the bottom. I'm basically just putting triangular bevel strips inside of a poster tube cap, which I scuffed up a little bit first using my rotary tool, because glue doesn't always like to stick to the smooth surface of plastic. I mean, it has a little bit of a lip on the inside, so that should keep them in there, but why not err on the side of caution, It cost me like half a cent, Then I placed it into the end of the tube and hot glued the tube to the middle of the pack. Then for the outboard nacelles, I used these former rocket bodies, which I cut down to size. Then I took foam circle offcuts and glued them in either end. The elevation has to match with the 2mm foam at the top, so I had to glue some random strips of foam between the backing and the tube before attaching them. Once they were on, I glued the gear-shaped end cap into the top of the poster tube. Then I glued a strip of foam around it to get it to match up with the backing. Then I made slanted pieces for the walls and internal ribs of the pack. After that, I put cardstock over them to close them up. Depending on how you want to attach it to your back, you may want to leave it open until you get straps in there. I'm just not using straps on this particular model, so it's not something that I'm going to worry about. You might use hooks. Then I made the outer details out of 4mm foam. First a strip to go along the top, then panels in a step formation. Then I heat formed a piece to have a slight curve in it for the middle tube. That's just so that it will adhere better and not put unnecessary tension on the glue. It also has a slanted edge at the top. Then I added 3 slanted details to the bottom. The top has to have a bit of a ledge, so I cut up a puzzle piece strip to fix that. Then I encased the nacelles in strips of foam. The nacelle coverings have kind of an interesting geometry. I made this piece out of these offcuts, which honestly, I don't really think that's necessary. You could make it just as easily from the side strips. But this is what rapid prototyping is all about. You discover a million ways how not to do something. Or you pay somebody else to do it and say that you invented everything. Isn't that right, Edison? Just saying. The exact shape of these panels changes depending on which character you're building, but in general, they have an angled notch at the bottom in the side. This is to accommodate the variants that have side-mounted rocket nozzles. I added these details below the ledge using the same methods as the rocket nose cone adapter just above it. I did have to trim them a little bit though, just so they'd be flush once the glue had dried. Then I made rocket nozzles out of mouthwash caps and spheres. I think they're supposed to be thruster quads, so I made 4 jets by drilling a hole into the center of a foam cylinder and then cutting them into donuts. Then I glued those on. So Boba Fett's jetpack has them on the side, which Makes sense if it's like a real jetpack, because you want the engine bell as far away from the person as possible, but Mando has them here, and Bo-Katan doesn't even have them at all. In fact, there's a version of the jetpack in Clone Wars that's incredibly simplified. It's even more compressed in on itself and oval, which makes sense for aerodynamics, but it's kind of one of those sci-fi things, like, we need 50 of these things, make them as simple as possible. That's what that cutout is for. And if you look closely in certain shots, you can see on the side of Mando's jetpack there's a hole to attach the thruster, even though it's placed down here. So I suspect they originally had them mounted here, and then it just became awkward because this is right at elbow length. So if he does any jerky movements, he's gonna contact the thruster and knock it off. This wall is supposed to extend a little bit further in from the back plate. Most of the jetpacks have sort of these skis on either side, and I think that's because, you know, this is a very flat, angular thing, and it's supposed to look like it matches up to the back of a person's armor, and humans aren't square. I'm gonna hold off on that for now until I built the back armor, just so that I can get it to match up as closely as possible. I also puttied up here to cover up some seams. Now the ends of these nacelles are flat right now, which is acceptable. I've seen that, but come on, do I really not have some kind of nose cone? I did a quick heat pass of all the foam parts to make them easier to paint. I don't want to do this for too long though, because I could inadvertently melt the hot glue. Although at that point, the whole thing would just catch on fire anyway, so melted hot glue would be the least of my worries. You know, I actually almost even like this as a Mandalorian rocket. Yeah, look at that. Look how much better that is. I also found these pieces for the nose cones of the nacelles. Then I coated everything in gray filler primer. This is just to even it out, because the fact that the foam is all different colors would cause the final coat to be different shades of green and not look right. Although if you don't need the final coat to be shiny, then you can just build this out of foam that's the same color as the rest of your armor and then leave it unpainted. Just a thought. Primer dries pretty quickly, so I hit it with a coat of green. That dries less quickly, so I'm going to work on the detail pieces. These are the two main greeblies. This is made out of a pen casing, PVC, and a cork. This is made out of a paintbrush and the base cap of a gumball machine prize. And these are going to be the axles on which the thrusters will pivot. Going to drill a hole in one of the thrusters, jets, whatever. Shove it in there and then skewer this into the side. Then I press them into the bottom of each nacelle. Somewhere in all this, I found and painted end caps for the tops of the nacelle. Then I attached the antenna. The last piece was the Boba Fett style rocket, which I made out of cardboard tubes, cardstock paper, and solo cups, because apparently I'm still in college. When it was all together, I dry brushed the edges with silver and smudged the trenches with heavily watered down black to simulate weathering. I'm using acrylic silver this time rather than rub and buff, because eventually I'm gonna have to repaint this to match what the client decides on. And rub and buff has wax in it, but that's what it is. It's a wax metallic finish, which would mess up a top coat. And that was it. That's how to make a Boba Fett jetpack, or any Mandalorian jetpack, come to think of it. Thanks for watching, everyone. Once again, I'd like to thank my patrons, whose names are scrolling by right now. Their support is what brings you their really complex builds, such as blasters, space helmets, lightsabers, droids, etc. I've got like 400 builds, guys. I'm not gonna list them all. Oh, xenomorphs. And yeah, that's it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the bell icon to be notified of future uploads. Let me know what you thought of this build in comments down below, and what else would you like to see me make. Thanks for watching, thanks for supporting me. Happy crafting, see you later.